Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Oh, and it's June today, isn't it? June started today, so happy Pride, everybody. You know, that's a big deal. It's important. Just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, last we left off, the Mock Turtle had a story to tell us, and let's hear his story now.
"You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing,"
said the Duchess as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that, well, perhaps it was only the pepper that made her so savage when they met in the kitchen. "When I'm a Duchess," she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone, "I won't have any pepper in my kitchen at all. Soup does very well without, actually. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered," she went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule. "And vinegar makes them sour, and chamomile makes them bitter, and barley sugar and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that, then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know." She'd quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about..." Wait, she's in close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, my dear. And that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. "Tut, tut, child, everything's got a moral, if only you can find it," said the Duchess. And then she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice didn't much like keeping so close to her, first because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin upon Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she didn't like to be rude, so she bore it as well she could. "The game's going on rather better now," she said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round." "Somebody said," Alice whispered, "that it's done by everybody minding their own business." "Ah, well, it means much the same thing," said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder as she added, "and the moral of that is, take care of the scents and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I won't put my arm around your waist," the Duchess said after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try the experiment?" He might bite," Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. "Very well," said the Duchess. "Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "Only mustard isn't a bird," Alice remarked. "Right as usual. What a clear way you have of putting things." "It's a mineral, I think," said Alice. "Of course it is," said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree to everything that Alice had said. There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "Oh, I know," exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. "It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is." "I quite agree with you, and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you'd like it put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that you were or might have been, was not otherwise than what you would have been, had appeared to them otherwise." Yes, that's that much of a word salad, I promise. I think I should understand that better," Alice said very politely. "If I had it written down, I can't quite follow it as you say it." "There's nothing to what I could say if I chose," the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. "Pray don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that," said Alice. "Oh, don't talk about trouble. I make you a present of everything I said as yet." A cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad they don't give birthday presents like that. But she didn't venture to say it out loud. "Thinking again?" the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. "I've a right to think," said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly, and the But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favorite word, moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "A fine day, your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice.
"I give you fair warning,"
shouted the Queen, stamping on the ground as she spoke.
"Either you or your head must be off, and then about have no time. Take your choice."
The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment.
"Let's go on with the game,"
the Queen said to Alice, and Alice was too much frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the Queen merely remarking that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarreling with the other players, and shouting, "Off with his head! Or off with her head!" Those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by the end of a half hour or so there were no archers left, and all the players, except the King, the Queen, and Alice, were in custody and others under sentence of their execution. Then the Queen left off quite out of breath and said to Alice,
"Have you seen the mock turtle yet?"
"No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is."
"It's the thing mock turtle soups came from,"
said the Queen. "I've never seen one or heard of one."
"Come on, then, and I'll tell you his history."
As they walked off together, Alice heard the King say in a low voice to the company generally, You are all pardoned. Come now, that's a good thing." "Oh, come, that's a good thing," she said to herself, for she felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a Gryphon lying fast asleep in the sun. If you don't know what a Gryphon is, look at the picture that's not in this book, and you clearly couldn't see or hear. Well, you couldn't see it, at least. You could probably hear it if I described it to you. Well, a Gryphon is it's got the body of a lion and the head of an eagle. It's a very regal creature. Anyway.
"I'll play the thing," said the Queen, "and take this young lady to see the mock turtle and hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions I have ordered."
And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the Gryphon. Alice didn't quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after that savage Queen, so she waited. The Gryphon sat up and rubbed its eyes. Then it watched the Queen until she was out of sight, and then it chuckled.
"What fun,"
said the Gryphon, half to itself and half to Alice. "What is the fun?" said Alice.
"Why, see, it's all her fancy, that. They never execute nobody, you know. Come on."
"Everybody says come on here," thought Alice as she went slowly after it. "I never was so ordered about in all my life, never." They hadn't gone far before they saw the mock turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock, and as they came nearer, Alice could hear him sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What's his sorrow?" she asked the Gryphon, and the Gryphon answered, very nearly in the same words as before,
"It's all his fancy, that. He hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on."
So they went up to the mock turtle, who looked at them with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing.
"You see her, young lady, she wants to know for your history, she do." "I'll tell her. Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word until I've finished,"
said the mock turtle. So they sat down, and nobody spoke for some minutes. Alice thought to herself, I don't see how he can ever finish if he doesn't begin, but she waited patiently.
"Once I was a real turtle,"
said the mock turtle at last with a deep sigh. These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation of "Hark!" from the Gryphon and the constant heavy sobbing of the mock turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she couldn't help thinking there must be more to come, so she sat still and said nothing.
"When we were little,"
the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, though still sobbing a little now and then,
"we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise."
"Why'd you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?"
"We called him Tortoise because he taught us,"
said the Mock Turtle angrily.
"Really, you are very dull."
You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a very simple question," added the Gryphon, and then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. At last the Gryphon said to the Mock Turtle, "Drive on, old fellow, don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words.
Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you mayn't believe it."
"I never said I didn't."
"You did."
Hold your tongue,"
added the Gryphon, before Alice could speak again, and the Mock Turtle went on.
"We had the best of educations. In fact, we went to school every day."
"I've been to a day school too," said Alice. "You needn't be so proud as all that."
"With extras?"
asked the Mock Turtle a little anxiously. "Yes, we learned French and music."
"And washing?"
said the Mock Turtle. "Certainly not," said Alice indignantly.
"But then yours wasn't a really good school,"
said the Mock Turtle in a tone of great relief.
"Now with ours they had at the end of the bill French, music, and washing extra."
"Well, you couldn't have wanted it much, living at the bottom of the sea."
"I couldn't afford to learn it,"
said the Mock Turtle with a sigh.
"I only took the regular course, you see."
"What was that?"
"Reading and writing, of course, to begin with,"
the Mock Turtle replied.
"and then the different branches of arithmetic. Ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision."
"Ah, I've never heard of uglification. What is it?" The Gryphon lifted both its paws in surprise.
"What? Never heard of uglifying? You know what to beautify is, I suppose?"
Yes, said Alice doubtfully. "It means to make anything prettier."
"Well then, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton."
Alice didn't feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle. And said, "What else had you to learn?"
"Well, there was mystery,"
the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flappers.
"Mystery, ancient and modern, with geography. The drawling master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils."
"What was that like?"
"Well, I can't show it to you myself. I'm proof stiff, and the Gryphon never learned it."
"I had the time. I went to the classics master, though. He was an old crab, he was."
"I never went to him,"
the Mock Turtle said with a sigh.
"He taught laughing in Greece, they used to say."
So he did,
said the Gryphon, sighing in his turn. And both creatures hid their faces in their paws. "And how many hours a day did you do lessons?" said Alice, in a hurry to change the subject.
10 hours the first day, 9 the next, and so on,"
said the Mock Turtle. "What a curious plan."
"That's the reason they're called lessons."
That's the reason they're called lessons," the Gryphon remarked, "because they lessen from day to day."
This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. "Then the 11th day must have been a holiday."
"Of course it was."
And how did you manage on the 12th?
That's enough about lessons,
The Gryphon interrupted in a very decided tone.
Tell her something about the games now.
Speaking of games, one moment. Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice.
Same as if he had a bone in his throat, said the Gryphon, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back.
At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again.
You may not have lived much under the sea.
I haven't.
And perhaps you were never even introduced to a lobster.
I once tasted, but checked herself. Alice began to say, I once tasted, but checked herself hastily and said, No, never.
So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is.
Hang on, I need to make sure I'm saying this word correctly. It's like spelled as in quad, as in four, real. Quadrille. A square dance performed typically by 4 couples and containing 5 figures, each of which is a complete dance in itself. Huh. Today I learned. No, indeed. What sort of a dance is it?
Why, you must form into a line upon the seashore.
2 lines,
Cried the Mock Turtle.
Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. Then when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way,
That generally takes some time.
you advance twice.
Each with a lobster as a partner.
Of course. Advance twice, set to partners.
Change lobsters and retire in the same order.
Then you throw the
The lobsters!
Shouted the Gryphon with a bound into the air.
as far out to sea as you can.
You swim after them,
Screamed the Gryphon.
Turn a somersault in the sea.
Cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about.
Change lobsters again.
Yelled the Gryphon at the top of its voice.
Back to land again, and that's all the first figure,
said the Mock Turtle, who suddenly dropped his voice. And the 2 creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all this time, sat down again, very sadly and quietly, and looked at Alice. It must be a very pretty dance, said Alice timidly.
Would you like to see a little of it?
Said the Mock Turtle. Very much indeed, said Alice.
Come, let's try the first figure,
said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon.
We could do without lobsters, you know. Which shall sing?
No, you sing, I've forgotten the words,
said the Gryphon. So they began, solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. Will you walk a little faster? said a whiting to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Will you join the dance? Will you, won't you? Will you, won't you? Won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us, with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not join the dance. What matters it how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off England, the nearer it is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, and come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Thank you, it's a very interesting dance to watch, said Alice, feeling very glad that it was over at last. And I do so like that curious song about the wedding.
Oh, as to the wedding,
said the Mock Turtle.
You've seen them, of course.
Yes, I've often seen them. It didn't... She checked herself hastily.
I don't know where Din might be. But if you've seen them so often, of course you know what they're like.
I believe so. They have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over crumbs.
You're all wrong about the crumbs,
said the Mock Turtle.
Crumbs would all wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is...
Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. That was good timing.
Tell her about the reason and all that.
Rather,
tell her about the reason and all that,
he said to the Gryphon.
The reason is that they would go with the lobsters to the dance, so they got thrown out to the sea. So they had to fall a long way, so they got their tails fast in their mouths, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all.
Thank you, it's very interesting, said Alice. I never knew so much about a wedding before.
I can tell you more than that if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why it's called a wedding?
I never thought about that. Why?
It does the boots and shoes,
the Gryphon replied very solemnly. And at this Alice was thoroughly puzzled. Does the boots and shoes? She repeated.
Why, what are your shoes done with? I mean, what makes them so shiny?
Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer. They're done with blacking, I believe.
Boots and shoes under the sea, the Gryphon went on, are done with whiting, now you know.
And what are they made of? asked Alice in a tone of great curiosity.
Soles and eels, of course. Any shrimp could have told you that.
If I'd been the whiting, said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, I'd have said to the porpoise, "Keep back, please, we don't want you with us."
They were obliged to have you with them. No white fish would go anywhere without a porpoise.
Wouldn't it really? said Alice in a tone of great surprise.
Of course not. Why, if a fish came to me and said he was going a journey, I should say with one porpoise.
Don't you mean purpose?
I mean what I say,
the Mock Turtle replied in an offended tone, and the Gryphon added, Come,
let's hear of some of your adventures.
I could tell you my adventures, beginning from this morning, said Alice a little timidly, but it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then.
Explain all that.
No. The adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. The explanations take such a dreadful time.
So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it, just at first. The two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet until she got to the part about her repeating, "Your old Father William" to the caterpillar, and the words all coming different. And then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said,
That's very curious.
It's all about as curious as it can be, said the Gryphon.
It all came different,
the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully.
I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin.
He looked at the Gryphon as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat 'tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Gryphon. How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons, thought Alice. I might as well be at school at once. However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the Lobster Quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came very strange indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have picked me too brown, I must sugar my hair." As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons, and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he's happy as a lark, and will talk in contemptuous tones of the shark. But when the tide rises and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound. "Well, that's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Gryphon.
Well, I never heard it before,
said the Mock Turtle,
but it sounds uncommon nonsense.
Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again.
I should like to have it explained,
said the Mock Turtle. She can't explain it. Go on with the next verse.
But what about his toes? How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?
It's the first position in dancing, Alice said, but she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject. Go on with the next verse, the Gryphon repeated impatiently. It begins, I passed by his garden. Alice didn't dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would all come wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice. I passed by his garden, and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet.
What is the use of repeating all that stuff?
The Mock Turtle interrupted.
If you don't explain it as you go on, it's by far the most confusing thing I've ever heard.
Yes, I think you'd better leave off, said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. Shall we try another figure of the Lobster Quadrille? The Gryphon went on. Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song? Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind, Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone, No accounting for tastes. Sing a turtle soup, will you, old fellow? The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice sometimes choked with sobs, to sing this. Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for two? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. To the chorus again, cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it, when a cry of, The trial's beginning, was heard in a distance. Come on, cried the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. What trial is it? Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, Come on, and ran the faster, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. I'm sorry. I gotta have I gotta have a drink of water and laugh at that. Oh man. Oh. Goodness gracious. Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them. All sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand round the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her, to pass away the time. Alice had never been in the court of justice before, but she read about them in books. And she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself, because of his great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore the crown over the wig, well, he didn't look at all comfortable, and it certainly wasn't becoming. And that's the jury box, thought Alice, and those 12 creatures. She was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some of them were birds. I suppose they're the jurors. She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. Jurors, jurors. She was very pleased about that word. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. What are they doing? Alice whispered to the Gryphon. They can't have begun to put anything down yet. The trial hasn't begun. They're putting down their names, the Gryphon whispered in reply. For fear they should forget them before the end of the trial. Stupid things, Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, "Silence in the court!" and the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously round to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. A nice muddle their slates will be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice couldn't stand. She went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill the Lizard, couldn't make out at all what had become of it, so, after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate.
"Herald, read the accusation,"
said the king. On this the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away.
"Consider your verdict,"
the king said to the jury. Not yet, not yet, the rabbit hastily interrupted. There's a great deal to be coming before that.
"Call the first witness,"
said the king, and the white rabbit blew 3 more blasts on the trumpet, and called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. I beg pardon, Your Majesty, for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for."
"You ought to have finished," said the king. "When did you begin?"
The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think it was.
15th,
said the March Hare. 16th, added the Dormouse.
Write that down,
the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence.
Take off your hat,
the king said to the Hatter. It isn't mine, though, said the Hatter.
Stolen! Whoa!
the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. I keep them to sell, the Hatter added as an explanation. I've none of my own, you see, I'm a Hatter. Here the Queen put on her spectacles and began staring at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted.
Give your evidence, said the king, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot.
This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the Queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court, but on second thought she decided to remain where she was, as long as there was room for her.
I wish you wouldn't squeeze so,
said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her.
I can hardly breathe.
I can't help it, said Alice very meekly. I'm growing.
You've no right to grow here,
said the Dormouse. Oh, don't talk nonsense. You know you're growing too.
Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace, said the Dormouse. Not in that ridiculous fashion.
And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the Queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse... just as the Dormouse crossed the court, he said to one of the officers of the court, "Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off.
Give your evidence,
the king repeated angrily,
or I'll have you executed whether you're nervous or not.
I'm a poor man, your majesty, the Hatter began in an incredibly shaky voice, and I hadn't begun my tea, not above a week or so, and what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea...
The twinkling of the what?
It began with the tea, the Hatter replied.
Of course twinkling begins with a tea,
said the king sharply.
Do you take me for a dunce? Go on.
I'm a poor man, the Hatter went on, and most things twinkled after that, only the March Hare said...
I didn't,
the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry.
You did. I deny it. He denies it,
said the king.
Leave out that part.
Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said... The Hatter went on, looking anxiously round to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse didn't deny anything. It was half asleep. After that I cut some more bread and butter.
But what did the Dormouse say?
One of the jury asked. That I can't remember.
You must remember, or I'll have you executed,
remarked the king. The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter, and went down on one knee. I'm a poor man, your majesty.
You're a very poor speaker,
said the king. Here one of the guinea pigs cheered, and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. They did this with a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon it. Wow, that's one way to suppress someone in the court. Yikes! I'm glad I've seen that done, thought Alice. I've so often read in newspapers at the end of trials there was some attempts at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court, and I never understood what it meant until now.
If that's all you know about, you may stand down. I can't go no lower, said the Hatter. I'm on the floor as it is. Then you may sit down, the king replied.
Here the other guinea pig cheered, and he too was suppressed. Come, that finished the guinea pigs, thought Alice. Now we shall get on better.
I'd rather finish my tea,
said the Hatter, dashing an anxious look at the Queen, who was reading the list of singers.
You may go,
said the King, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put his shoes on.
And just take his head off outside,
the Queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door.
Call the next witness,
said the King. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was before she even got into the court by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once.
Give your evidence, said the King.
Shan't, said the cook. The King looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness.
Well, if I must,
the King said with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook until his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice,
What are tarts? What are tarts made of?
Pepper, mostly, said the cook.
Treacle,
said a sleepy voice behind her. For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, trying to get the Dormouse turned out, and whatever else the Queen was trying to say. She speaks so quickly, it's so difficult. By the time they'd settled down again, the cook had disappeared.
Oh, never mind,
the King said, with an air of great relief.
Call the next witness.
And he added in an undertone to the Queen,
Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It makes my forehead ache.
Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. For they haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name Alice! Chapter 12, Alice's Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she'd grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, and there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon!" she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box or they would die.
The trial cannot proceed, said the King in a very grave voice, until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All of them,
he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said this. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she'd put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. Not that it signifies much, she said to herself. I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other. As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being upset and their slates and pencils been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the incident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing into the roof of the court.
What do you know about this business?
The King said to Alice. Nothing, said Alice.
Nothing whatever, persisted the king.
Nothing whatever.
That's very important,
the king said, turning to the jury. They were beginning to write this down on their slates when the rabbit interrupted. Unimportant, your majesty means, of course, he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke.
Unimportant, of course, I meant,
the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone.
Important, unimportant, unimportant, important,
as if he were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote it down important, and some wrote it unimportant. Alice could see this as she was near enough to look over their slates. But it doesn't matter a bit, she said to herself. At this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, cackled out "Silence!" and read out from his book,
Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court.
Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, said Alice.
You are,
said the king. Nearly 2 miles high, added the queen. Well, I shan't go at any rate, said Alice. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You just invented it now.
It's the oldest rule in the book.
Then it ought to be number 1. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily.
Consider your verdict,
he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. There's more evidence to come yet. Please, your majesty. This paper has just been picked up. What's in it? I haven't opened it yet, but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody, said the White Rabbit.
It must have been that, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know. Who's it directed to?
Said one of the jurymen. Well, that is to say, it isn't directed at all. In fact, there's nothing written on the outside. He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, It isn't a letter after all, it's a set of verses.
Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?
Asked another of the jurymen. No, they're not. And that's the strangest thing about it, said the White Rabbit. And at this the jury all looked puzzled.
He must have imitated somebody else's hand,
said the king. And at this the jury all brightened up again. Please, your majesty, I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end, said the knave.
If you didn't sign it, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man.
There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said that day. That proves his guilt, said the queen. It proves nothing of the sort, said Alice. Why, you don't even know what they're about.
Read them,
said the king. And at this the White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin, please, your majesty?
Begin at the beginning, the king said gravely, and go on until you come to the end, and then stop.
These were the verses the White Rabbit read. They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them the word I had not gone. We knew it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts you to set them free exactly as we were. Maybe you used to pronounce word differently, because that rhyme doesn't make sense in modern English. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him, ourselves, and it. Don't let him know she liked him best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me.
That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet,
said the king, rubbing his hands.
So now, let the jury...
If any one of them can explain it, said Alice. She'd grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. I'll give him 6pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in all that. You must excuse me. I need to have some water every now and again. Anyway, the jury all wrote down on their slates, "She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it," but none of them attempted to explain the paper.
If there's no meaning in it, that saves the world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet I don't know,
he went on, spreading out the verses on his knee and looking at them with one eye.
I seem to see some meaning in them, after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?
He added, turning to the knave. And the knave at this shook his head sadly. Do I look like it? He said, which he, in fairness, certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard.
All right, so far,
said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself.
Oh, we know it to be true, and that's a year, of course. I gave for one, they gave him two. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know.
But it goes on, they all returned from him to you.
Why, there they are. You're quite right,
said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table.
Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit, you never had any fits, my dear, I think,
he said to the queen. Never, said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger as he found it and made no mark. But now he hastily began again, using the ink that was trickling down his face, at least as long as it lasted.
When the words don't fit you,
said the king, looking round the court with a smile. There was a dead silence.
It's a pun,
the king added in his offended tone, and everybody laughed.
Let the jury consider their verdict,
the king said for about the 20th time that day. No, sentence first, verdict afterward. Stuff and nonsense! The idea of having the sentence first, said Alice loudly. Hold your tongue, the queen said, practically turning purple. I won't. Up with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice, but nobody moved. Who cares for you, said Alice, who had grown to her full size by this time. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. "Oh, wake up, Alice, dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had!" "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember then, all these strange adventures of hers that you'd just finished reading about. And when she had finished, her dear sister kissed her, and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly, but now run into your tea, it's getting late." And so Alice got up and ran off, thinking, while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still, just as she'd left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion, and this was her dream. First she dreamed of little Alice herself. First she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that strange little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed around it, and once more the shriek of the Gryphon, the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. And so she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again and all would change to dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling of teacups would change to tinkling of sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy. And the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the Gryphon, all the other strange noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end. Alright, so that's the end of Alice in Wonderland. I have several books lined up real quick to continue, but I kind of want to just close this off either a very short story. I have a very short story. I don't know if I have a peculiarly short story that we could just read out real quick. Because the issue is we finished Alice in Wonderland now, and I don't want to start a book and not finish it. Do I have a set of short stories on here that I could just read one of the short stories here? I'm sure I do. Sorry, I'm looking through my e-reader for people who are listening to this as the audio recording. I'm sure I have some kind of pieces of short stories here somewhere. Sherlock Holmes, but I simply don't have time for a whole Sherlock Holmes story. What else? We have the science fiction serials, but I don't want to do those because I've been reading them on my own now. There is a story chunk here. I have something like a set of 5 or 6 really short science fiction stories that... Oh, there they are. To Steal an Angel. We could read these. Let's see here. Let's see what there is here. Gosh dang, does this have a page of contents? Go to beginning. There's a few short stories in here. Yeah, there's To Steal an Angel, which is a really neat one and has a really neat twist. Going Back, Mauve on Black, Non-Existent Cats, and Shadows. Are there any of them that I can read on here? You know what? I'm going to read
The Shadows one is really good. Let me see if I can get it to come up. Oh, goodness gracious. It's near the end. Let me go to the end and scroll backward. But I'm sure it exists. There's also like one about planet full of fighting styles, which I need to finish reading. When was this copyrighted? Okay, Shadows first appeared in Space 7, Tony Richards, 1981. So, yeah, I'm sure nobody's going to chase me down about that. And I'm sure we can also read that in enough time. It's got a really neat twist and all that. I don't know, I need to find something that's just a bunch of really short stories that let me, in case I don't, that is to say, non-existent cats. The non-existent cats one is cute, but, not for here. It's about like a ghostly cat. Anyway, let's start in on this Shadows story, because I want to not just have 1 hour be all that we've done this evening, and this is a really neat short story anyway. Hang on, before we start, I'm going to pause the recording. Alright, I gave a little pause there for everyone to kind of pause the video and go get a drink of water of your own, because that's what I did while I had the recording paused. I went and got a glass of water to drink. Maybe you might even want to, grab some snacks of some kind if you're feeling hungry. We'll see. But that's up to you, not up to me. Let's get into the story, shall we? Shadows. The old coal cellar was dark as a grave, the old coal cellar was dark as a grave, and as nobody had used it over the years, the darkness seemed to thicken. Deep as oceans, chill as night, it was a well of never-ending black, a huddling place for shadows. Underneath the raker's house it lay, unused, forsaken, forgotten. Except Terry Raker still went there at times, his best friend Peter Hutchins in reluctant tow. The door from the inside of the house had been locked some years ago, so the boys were forced to climb in through the coal hole round the back. There was a special eerie thrill each time they opened the flap, peered inside, and were hit smack in the face by the escaping fetid air. There was a feel like fog and ice crystals inside their spines each time they clambered down, and a single guttering candle was all they took. They stayed down there for hours, or what seemed like hours. "Why do we come down here?" Peter's voice echoed like bouncing rubber on the mossy walls. Terry stared at him, seeing how afraid he appeared in this bad light. Older, smaller, different. Outside, children were playing in the park, enjoying the hot weather which had fallen over Tensville. "That's a stupid question. We come because it's here, that's why. There are a lot of other places which are here. The park, the playground." "Are you scared, Peter?" "Me?" Peter cleared an iceberg from his throat. "No, of course not." "Good, 'cause I'm going deeper right back. I'll bet it's been years since anybody's been there," Terry said, and he heard Peter clear his throat a second time. Harder this time, with even more difficulty, with reason. The back of the cellar was the darkest place of all. The floor had subsided a good couple of feet, and the shadows clustered there like bats in some primeval cave. They absorbed light and voices, everything. They ate like acid at the outline of your flesh. Terry knew his friend hated going there, but hadn't he just said he wasn't scared? He was hung by his own words. They went together single file, Terry in front, quietly. There was a staircase in the gloom, the railing gone, the doorway at the top unseen.
The broken light bulbs not been replaced since the door had been locked, a still pendulum, enshrouded in cobwebs. Silverfish skimming like shooting stars to their cold homes beneath the walls. A mouse all ghost-pale fur and clicking feet. The candle flickered like a shifting orange eye, fighting a losing battle against the everlasting night. And all around the two boys, a dozen of themselves, each different, distorted, grotesque, following them, stalking them. Even Terry felt the spider touch of fear, and feeling it he knew why he came to this sunless place. To be afraid was the greatest excitement of them all. He stopped, raised the candle, and stared. They had come to the very end, but something was wrong. "What's that?" "I don't know," Peter said from behind him, his voice like broken glass. "A shadow, I guess." "A shadow of what?" Terry glanced around, searching for something he already knew wouldn't be there. Something 6 foot tall and upright. Something slim, tapering towards the pointed tip. Something in the shape of a space rocket. "That's ridiculous," he told himself, and held the candle closer. The slim shadow didn't even waver. It must be a damp patch on the wall. But it wasn't. It must be a trick of the light. It can't possibly... A hiss of escaping air cut short his doubts. The candle danced around and almost went out. Terry cupped his hand around the flame and watched as a rectangle of gloom swung out from the side of the main shadow, like a hatch opening in the hull of a ship. "Something's coming out." "Don't be stupid," Terry snapped back and grabbed his friend's wrist to stop him from running. What could fit in anything that small? But there was a shape now moving from the open hatch. This long and furled like a tight scroll of dark parchment. It floated up alongside the image of the ship, and then began to unroll itself, feet dangling down on ebon legs, reaching at last to the ground. Trunk, shoulders, arms, revealing themselves like an unfurled map. The neck, shadow yet solid, and finally the head, held high, boy high. High as Terry or Peter. Just right. 2 smudges of incredible black marked out its eyes. It looked, and it reached toward them. Terry and Peter broke and turned and ran, out across the cellar floor, slipping and sliding in the damp, through the coal hole, through the flap, grazing their knees as they went. Into the fresh air, the light, the warmth. At last they slumped against the side of Terry's house, gasping and shaking. "Has it followed us?" "I don't think so." Sweat was burning Terry's eyes. He rubbed it out, and as the sunlit world came back into focus, they began to calm. A rocket ship in the cellar, a man made out of shadow. Here beyond the coal cellar it seemed so far away. Ridiculous almost, like a dream, the kind the others would laugh at. As he gazed at Peter, their eyes met, and he knew his friend was thinking the same. "It might have been a trick of the light," Terry agreed with him quietly. "Down there in that creepy place, our imaginations might run away with us. Nothing there, really. Nothing at all." They both nodded gravely. Peter straightened himself up, brushed at his clothes, and said, "I'd better get home now, Terry," although it was nowhere near lunchtime. "Okay," Terry said, standing up beside him. Then, "That's odd." He pointed to the ground, and below them their 2 shadows stretched across the dust. "Your shadow, it looks a bit darker than mine." "Your eyes haven't adjusted yet," Peter replied, and walked quickly toward his home. Evening fell. With it came the smell of home cooking and the clatter of cutlery. Terry's father had got home late from the Tensville hardware store, and was tucking into his dinner so fast it took him some while to notice his son wasn't eating.
"Terry, what are you staring at?"
Terry turned his head away from the hallway, from the door to the cellar. "Nothing much."
"Well, try to ignore nothing much for a while. Eat your food before it gets cold."
Obediently, Terry set to work on the contents of his plate. It was stew, his favorite, but he found it hard to concentrate. All this evening he fancied he could hear noises coming from the cellar. Tiny sounds no more than fragile whispers. But there they were, and he was sure of it. His third forkful stopped halfway to his mouth. Dad?
Uh-huh?
What's that word that means something solid? You know, upwards, sideways, and backwards? Both his parents looked bemused. A cautious smile broke across his father's face, though.
Oh, you mean three-dimensional. Why do you ask?
It's just that everything in this world is three-dimensional, isn't it?
Almost everything, yes.
Except for shadows, they're only two-dimensional,
I never thought of that.
his father said.
We've got a budding Einstein here. Go on.
Well, if there was a two-dimensional world somewhere in the universe, the people would look like shadows to us. They could walk alongside us and we'd never know. Maybe they could slide through narrow doors. He risked another glance at the hallway. Under doors, through any narrow gap, really. His father sighed, turned to his wife, and said,
Don't bother to phone the Science Institute, Margaret. I don't think we've got a young Einstein after all. He can't tell fact from fantasy.
It's a clever idea, Terry, his mother added consolingly, but I don't think there's such a place. Finish your meal. It's peaches for dessert.
But somehow, for the first time in years, dessert was left untouched on Terry's plate. A faint noise awoke Terry in the dead of night. He didn't hear it so much as sense it. A movement, alien and weird. It was coming from outside. Softly, he pushed back the sheets and tiptoed across the cold night floor to the window. He parted the curtains, and a shaft of silver moonlight made him blink, and then he could see the backyard properly. The trees were moving in the breeze, the fence creaked anciently on its posts. Nothing there but the roses and the swing and the shed for keeping tools. Nothing in sight. It must have been just a cat, or maybe the wind, or perhaps his imagination. Again, though, there was another noise. There was something down there. He peered down at the coal hole. It was hard to tell at this angle, but the flap seemed to just slightly raise. The slimmest gap, just enough to let a wafer-thin object sidle through. And there, a shadow. Not of a branch, a cat, or a cloud. It was a living, moving shadow. It was a hand and an arm, drawing a dark and two-dimensional body out of the coal cellar. The shadow being looked around, then moved toward the trees as easily as a sheet of newspaper wafting across the ground. Terry followed it with his gaze, stared at the spot where it was headed, saw more movement amongst the darkened pines. 3 of them, maybe 4, waiting for their companion. A long time after they had slipped under the fence and vanished, Terry was still standing at the window, with his eyes fixed on nothing and his jaw completely slack. More than one of them. Many more than one. In the shadow rocket, rolled like parchments, packed like sardines. Hundreds of them, perhaps, spreading through Tensville. Invading? Invading.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Peter.
Terry, hi.
The morning sun was already bright and hot and high. The perfect day for swimming in the lake or running wild across the fields, but Peter seemed ill, or at least ill at ease. He was pale, sickly looking. Within his pallid face, his eyes were squinting, they were almost shut. As if he didn't like the sun. He loitered in the shade of the house. Look, Peter, we've got to talk. The thing we saw yesterday in the cellar, I think it might have been real. Peter regarded him through slits so tiny it was a wonder he could see it all.
I don't think so, he murmured. It's best we forget it. I want to spend my day
swimming in the lake, Terry broke in angrily. Running across fields, how can you even think of that while that thing's still...
I wasn't. Today I'm going to spend all day at the library. Are you coming?
Peter was the least bookish person Terry had ever known. He'd only ever read comics, and his grades at school reflected it. Anyone would be insane to spend a summer's day like this amongst the silent, dusty bookshelves of the library, but Peter? It was inconceivable. Right then, Terry noticed something odd about his friend's shadow. Not only was it darker than the day before, but it just didn't seem to be behaving right. Terry couldn't put his fingers on it, but at school there was a game they played called Mirrors. Only two people could play. The first pretended he was standing in front of a full-length mirror, and the other, standing opposite, would be his reflection. The first would raise his arm, and the other did the same. The first would scratch his nose, two noses would be scratched. It was like that with Peter's shadow, imitating his every move. Very careful, very skilled. But if you watched closely enough, you'd see it just wasn't quite right. There were dark smudges for his eyes. And normal shadows, they didn't have eyes. Terry shuddered, and he'd just realized how the invasion worked. You cold? Me, I'm baking. I gotta get out of the sun before it fries me. See you later. No, wait. I'm coming with you. I'm coming with you, Peter. And so he followed Peter at a safe distance, watching as the shadow led the boy through the sheltered back streets at a trot. It seemed impatient to reach the library, and Terry could soon see why. There were 4 other people sitting at the desks beside the reference section. 4 people who simply should not have been there. Mr. Hardwick, who spent from dawn to dusk running the general store. Miss Brown, who only read romance novels. Another boy, John Turnbull, from across town. And 5-year-old Meg Donaldson. Their subjects: energy, fuel, transport, police, military, advanced physics. Meg Donaldson, 5 years old, reading advanced physics? They each had deep, dark shadows, and their own skins all looked pale. Peter pulled a book off the shelves and sat down at the end of the line, opening the tome across the scarred wooden desk. National Geography, his most hated subject.
Oh, I'm sorry, hang on a second. The light is flickering, and that's not. The
light is trying to tell me something. But what it's telling me isn't revealed until the end of the story. At the other side of the room, Miss Gregg, the librarian, was busy with her file cards. Terry hoped she would notice what was going on, but she too had a dark shadow in tow. His father came into the room 2 evenings later.
Terry, I'd like a word with you. I don't know quite what's wrong, but you've been acting strangely lately.
It's not me that's strange.
No, then what about this?
His father pointed to the bottom of the door, where Terry had nailed an extra strip of carpet to block the slight gap.
And the same under the cellar door. There are no draughts in here.
It's not to keep out draughts.
In fact,
his father continued, ignoring him,
it's downright stifling in this room. What you need is some fresh air.
He went across to the window and tugged, looked surprised, and then tugged again until his face went red. I nailed it shut. I don't want it even slightly open. His father backed off to the center of the room and stared round as if he were surveying some bizarre Sistine chapel. Every gap, every crack was filled with putty stuffed with newspaper, blocked, jammed. His lips moved around 100 words before finding the right ones.
I've heard of old people being obsessed like this, but my boy, my son? Is this the same reason why you've been sleeping with a light on? You haven't done that since you were 3 years old.
I'm afraid.
Of the dark?
No, of shadows, of...
Two-dimensional people! Will you stop this nonsense before you drive us all crazy?
It's not nonsense. The whole town's changed. The people, they're pale, their shadows are deep. Men closing stores to gaze across the fields. Women staring through parlor windows, grim as death. Everyone's acting strangely, differently. Can't you see what's happening? Or maybe you don't want to see. His father restrained his temper with visible effort. He raised one taut muscled arm and pointed a trembling finger.
I want to stop to this at once, Terry. Right now. Put this room back in order at once.
It doesn't matter, Terry thought an hour later as he was prying from the nails from the window frame. If the shadows wanted me, they'd have taken me in the coal cellar. They're saving me for something. Beyond the glass, the houses were gravestones against the night. Not a light glowed anywhere. No shadows stole across the lawn this time. The invaders had each paired off with one of the townsfolk. Everyone except for Terry. And as he worked, he asked himself the same question, over and over again. Why? He met Peter the next morning, the first time in 3 days, and shouted, "Hi!" Peter went on walking, didn't even turn his head. Terry ran after him a little ways before completely stopping dead. His friend had changed almost completely. The shadow was black as the vacuum from which it had came, infinitely, impossibly black. Its outline was sharp and clear against the ground, almost as if it were a boy-shaped hole, bottomless, menacing. Peter, on the other hand, had grown far more than pale. He was a dim figure now, avoiding the sun, hugging the shady places like a ghost. What little light he touched passed right through him. The bricks to the adjacent houses showed through his skin. He was translucent, like a puppet made of frosted glass. He was barely human, barely anything at all. But Peter? But he was round the corner and gone. For a very long while, Terry stood with his arms hanging by his sides. He couldn't find the strength to move, nor the courage or the will. He just stood, trying not to scream. In the end, he wasn't sure whether he'd succeeded. The townsfolk passed around him like underexposed photographs. Now that their usefulness was coming to an end, they were becoming as insubstantial as shadows. "Harper's Electrical Goods," said the sign over the door. There were 2 old men asleep on the tall chairs outside, like 2 glass gnomes, all the cushions and woodwork showing clearly through their chests. Their shadows were leaning across the gap, conversing. Terry could hear them clearly now. Their voices were like wind through tinder grass, like disturbed autumn leaves. They stopped as he approached, stared up at him with ink smudges for eyes. Then he walked past quickly, into the dull confines of the shop. "Can I help you, young man?" Miss Harper loomed up behind the counter. Rotund, jolly Miss Harper, who had called him Terry from the day he had been born. Young man. "Yes, Terry licked his twitching upper lip. "A pencil light battery, please." He tried not to stare as Miss Harper leant forwards, but it was difficult. She was clear as a crystal vase, transparent as a goldfish bowl. She distorted her backdrop like a magnifying glass. Right now, a vacuum cleaner and its hose filled her. "We don't sell batteries here." "But, Miss Harper, this is an electric store. You must—" He cut himself short. The stand where the batteries were kept was empty. "You must have one somewhere, please." "What do you want it for?" Terry gazed at Miss Harper and then at her shadow. He had no doubts which he was really speaking to, and how he How could he tell her, that he planned to return to the Shadow rocket ship, and that his pocket torch was growing dim? There were more than just batteries missing from that shop. Every last bulb was gone, every lampstand had been thrown out. The radios were still there, but the fans, the vacuums, electric toothbrushes, alarm clocks, irons, toasters, bed warmers, plugs, but there was nothing, not a single thing, which cast electric light, as if it were a taboo.
Do you have a torch, young man?
No.
You're sure?
Absolutely. Terry began to back away, and at the same time Miss Harper edged towards him. Her backdrop flowed, bulging and rippling like tidal water. An assortment of fuses glowered through her arm. A special offer poster distorted her glass features. She reached out with one hand. It was almost lost in the gloom, but it was there.
Empty out your pockets.
Terry shook his head, and he backed up still further, discovering he'd been backing the wrong way as he crashed into a stand of car aerials. The spindly metal rods scattered this way and that, tumbling to the floor with a sound like broken xylophones. One of them landed on Mrs. Harper's foot, and sank through it like a warm knife through soft butter. She continued to advance, the lens of her body filling with cable reels, screwdrivers, cheap cassettes.
Give me that torch, young man.
It was an impulse, not a plan or a thought. Terry reached for his back pocket, pulled out his torch, and switched it on. Pale and yellow, very weak, a spot of light appeared on Miss Harper's shadow, and it writhed. The woman herself let out an anguished groan.
Stop that at once, or I'll make you sorry.
Terry shone the torch again, and as the woman stumbled back, he bolted for the door. Outside, the old man's shadows whipped around to glare at him, tried forcing the human bodies they were attached to awake and give chase to him, but he brandished the torch again, and they stopped that, passive, patient, and they watched him go. Back at his house, he shut all the windows, bolted all the doors, ran to the kitchen, knowing exactly what he was looking for. He had to empty exactly three drawers before he found it. An electric light bulb, the only one left in the house. He shook it, half expecting to hear the rattle of a broken element, but it was still intact. Now all he had to do was wait for his father to return home. It was 6:15 before his father came. The sun was sinking low, and in the failing light, Tensville seemed as unreal as a half-forgotten dream. The windows of the Raker house were glowing, gray as dust. Terry was still in the hallway when the key rattled in the lock. He'd been staring at the cellar door for so long he'd become transfixed. Now his head snapped up and his eyes came wide open. He realized the hallway was filled with gloom, and it didn't matter now that his father was back. He allowed a faint, weary smile to lift the corners of his mouth. The front door came wide open and a familiar silhouette filled it. "Dad!" Terry started toward his father. "I'm so glad you're back." The door shut, and his father stood quite still, as if waiting. "You've got to believe me now. You must have seen what happened to everyone. The shadow beings, they've almost taken over, but I found a way to fight them. They can't stand electric light. If you get the stepladder, we can go in the cellar and fit a new light bulb down there. You can fit it while I hold them at bay with my torch, see?" He held the pocket torch and final light bulb up for inspection. And then the thought struck him. Why is he so still? Why is he so quiet? Why hasn't he switched on the light? Where's Mom? She should be home by now. What's happening? "We can," he finished in a faltering voice, "we can destroy their ship. Show them we can fight back. Show them we're not helpless." A hand, empty and limpid as a surgeon's glove, swept down and knocked both lights out of his hand. They shattered against the wall. The hand came up, preparing to plunge down a second time. Terry turned and ran, blindly, careening off the walls. Somehow he found his way into the kitchen. Bruised, breathless, and frightened sick, he slumped against the stove for just a second, recovering his energy and his thoughts. They've got him too. Got all of them. I'm the only one left. Something which had once been his father moved toward the kitchen. A shadow filled the gaping doorway. Just a shadow. Only that. The human being had completely gone. The alien had disposed of him for good. Run. Run, run. Through the back door, legs pumping. Across the yard, heart pounding in his chest. Over the fence, down the back alley, out into the road. Till he finally ended up in the town square. Tensville was a necropolis around him, a ghost town filled with living ghosts. From every door, every gap, cruising like two-dimensional sharks, the shadows were coming. Terry's hands were clenched into tight fists, and in his right fist lay something, and it dug into his skin. He opened it, and a box of matches lay like sweet salvation in his palm. He must have picked it up from the stove without realizing. The shadows were drawing closer, closer. He shook the box, and it rattled far too much. He opened it carefully. There was only one match left. The aliens pressed close, silhouettes caught in the rising moon. They were all recognizable. That one had been Miss Harper, and that one Miss Brown. Hardwick there, John Turnbull there, McDonaldson, Miss Gregg, the teachers, traders, policemen, the mayor, Peter Hutchins. His parents were there too. Or rather, what was left of them. Mockeries of their images. Mirrors still reflecting darkly, long after their live subjects had gone. Shadows. They reached for him. Terry struck the match and held it high, and the shadows backed off slightly. There were sounds of hissing, even snarls. They tried to circle behind him, but he was too quick for them. The match was already 1/4 burnt through. Slowly he tried to back away, and the shadows followed at a distance, only half burnt now, and starting to recede. They lunged at him, and he leapt towards them and drove them back, dimmer. They stood away, waiting for the inevitable. They had all the time in the world now. Gone. A tendril of gray smoke curled from the dead matchstick. Terry let the sliver of wood fall from his limp grasp. It was over. He was finished. The best he could do was to go down fighting. So he clenched his fists again, preparing to box shadows. The first rank of aliens began to move and then stopped. Quite suddenly, quite without any reason. Immobile as statues now, they stood watching him with their bottomless black eyes. They parted for him next moment. Ahead of him lay the main road out of town. Without even thinking about it, Terry felt his legs start moving, one in front of the other, stiffly at first and then faster as his legs found their fluidity. A trot, a canter, then a gallop, then a screaming, headlong flight. He raced past the limits of Tensville out into the night. It was almost a half an hour before he dared to glance behind him. No one, nothing was following. The aliens had let him go, and if the thought passed through his mind that he might be their plague-bearer, carrying their invasion from town to town, then he thrust that thought aside. It was a long way down the road before he reached fresh civilization. No time for thoughts of any kind. He ran through oceans of moonlight and dark. Across the ground, almost perfectly, matching step for step. His shadow ran beside him. Alright, folks, that's about all I have prepared for this evening. Because I don't want to start on the next book quite yet. Because I know we're not going to be able to finish it in half an hour. But coming up next, I think we'll do The Picture of Dorian Gray, actually. I don't know. I would say we'll do The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, but, we did War of the Worlds at the beginning of this, and I kind of want to do Dorian Gray first. But after Dorian Gray, we're definitely doing Time Machine, and then The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and then
the Lovecraft story I have saved on here. And beyond there, well, maybe I'll finish Frankenstein by then and we can actually read Frankenstein. I'm not sure. If not, I can... there's still plenty of books living out in the world for me to go find. So, anyway, we'll cross that bridge when we're a little closer. This has been Paper Cuts. Before I go, I need to mention, I don't know if you all who watch Paper Cuts are the sort to watch my Frozen Tundra Finds episodes, but even if you're not, this is important. So Frozen Tundra Finds has reached the end of its second season, and what that means is that you all need to go vote on what games we're going to be playing out of this season's picks. Right now, currently I'm playing Orbiant because I picked that one out of this season to play while we're voting because it's a great time and I didn't want someone to not, I didn't want it to, go by the wayside because nobody wanted it. I wanted to play it. This one's for me, but you guys get to pick the next one, probably the next 2 or 3, while I build up more games for Frozen Tundra Finds, But please, 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 if you're watching this in the VOD, there is a link in the description to a Google form where you pick your top 3 favorite Frozen Tundra Finds games, and I really need you guys to vote, because last time 2 or 3 of you voted, and that made it very difficult to make a decision. So I would appreciate it dearly if you all voted this time. It makes it a lot easier on me, because then I can know what you guys want to see and not pick a game that only some of you wanted to see. But anyway, that's enough of my blithering. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.